Mi féidir é a bhoga. An brain fulla a dúirte go héamh mo bháthair anam. A dog starich o chléin im charbal uachtar. Bullán tuchas I ngurt mo warana. Ómchluch. A bhórín magne lena habítar valav. Curum ordóg rawer fé íocal an Feasa. Is lauren an galán os íochtar cófasa amach. Cúl le cinne. Mar is dúil cinne déad hort. Focal có crua le gráine gannive fé chapáin súle, atá íte có dlú le slugán isra. Nar a usglín scín tullas a bhéal margin, tá féacal sciabha in rad muvig, agus glés có hard le níomh an fearle, an ghoire neamhfurfa gan chevel. There's no denying the blood that goes through me from my mother's side, leaving one snarled tooth in the roof of my mouth, an itching post in the field of my thoughts, an ohmstone that shouts me down with its unintelligible alphabet. I put my swollen thumb under the tooth of knowledge, and the stone speaks up from the underworld of my thoughts. You were always a black sheep, like all belonging to you. Hard words like grains of sand, in the corner of an eyelid shut tight as an oyster. When a blade of light prizes it open, there's a tooth askew in my son's mouth. It shines like a pearl in his perfectly crooked smile. Hello, and welcome to Words That Burn, the podcast taking a closer look at poetry. This episode's poem is Oidhreacht, or Heredity, by Irish poet and Gaeilgeoir Louis de Puer. I've chosen the poem as a small nod to Seachtain na Gaeilge, which is currently underway here in Ireland. It's a 2-week-long celebration of the Irish language in the lead-up to St. Patrick's Day. Gaeilge is Ireland's native language and still remains its first official language on all documentation. It's sad to say that in this day and age, when you walk around the island, you might find opinions on it split down the middle. Depending on who you ask, some will claim it's alive and thriving, and others will scoff and claim it's dying, or worse yet, dead already. A man who has worked tirelessly to ensure that the former is true and the latter is false is Louis de Puer. De Puer is a file, or Irish poet. He has spent decades using poetry as a tool to modernise the Irish language and ensure that it's not seen as some ancient tongue on its last legs. His drive to do this began in the early days of his university career at the University College Cork, or UCC. It was there that he'd find his way onto the editorial team of Inti, a literary journal committed to bringing modernist techniques to Irish language literature. It was a radical thought at the time and would go on to become an entire movement within the Irish language scene. It was the 1970s, and the ideals and aims of Inti took their cue from the rebellious and experimental literary techniques of the beat poetry movement in the United States. Figures like Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac were role models for what Inti wanted to do with Gaeilge. The journal and its movement was not only a protest against the erasure of a native tongue, but also an adamant reclaiming of the Irish language for the younger generation of the island at the time. But who were they reclaiming the language from? It might seem counterintuitive that there was a schism at all. Surely, all those interested in preserving the language would be on the same side. Yet, it is that exact use of the word preserving that caused a fracture. From the earliest days of the Celtic revival, people were in two minds of what saving the language should look like. On the one side were the nativists, old-school Gaeilgeoirs, historians and academics, seeking to preserve a pure form of the Irish language. It was this group that saw Gaeilge as intrinsically tied to the pastoral. For them, any attempt to allow the language to evolve past the topics of the rural or the peasant was an affront to what Gaeilge was. This, frankly archaic viewpoint took on a deeper hold in the early days of the Irish Free State, and Gaeilge became synonymous with Eamon de Valera's oppressive and Catholicism-based vision for Ireland. In opposition to this cult of preservation stood the progressive language revival movement. It was a movement that saw none other than Padraig Pearse as its figurehead. This side had the viewpoint that modern European influence was a necessity in terms of both culture and literature to ensuring the Irish language's survival. In Pearse's own words, Irish literature, if it is to live and grow, must get into contact on the one hand with its own past, and on the other with the mind of contemporary Europe. This is the 20th century, and no literature can take root in the 20th century which is not of the 20th century. Inchy and its proponents firmly believed in this idea. Irish language needed to adapt to thrive in the 20th century and beyond. Their new approaches to Gaeilge were as much a rebellion against Irish society at the time as they were against the archaic nativist stance on the language. Theo Dorgan, in his essay for Archipelago magazine, captures the mood at the time wonderfully when he writes, "The power of the state to contain reality had withered. The electronic age and the first world generation were upon us. Rock and roll had thundered out across the world, and the short-lived counterculture, for a dizzy moment, held the commanding heights. The first transnational generation had arrived to claim its place in the sun, and considerably to the surprise of the Tweeds and Fáinne Brigade, this brash and exuberant generation of poets was as unremarkably at home in the Gaeltachts as in the hip, wide world." I would strongly recommend giving Dorgan's vibrant account of the Inchy counterculture movement a read. You'll find it linked below in the description of this episode. Though arriving later to the Inchy party, Louis de Puer found himself walking the tightrope of the old and new ways of Irish. The tension of that tug-of-war is remarkably similar to the tension being explored in Heredity. Rather than two societal movements, this poem centres on a speaker at war with his own body, which is simultaneously being held in place and torn in two by past and present. That struggle is evident from the first stanza. Mi féidir é evokes. An brain fulla a dúirte go héamh mo wathair anam. A dog starich o chléin im charbal uachtar. Bullán tuchas in nurt mo warana. Ómchluch. A bhórín magna and a habítar valav. There's no denying the blood that goes through me from my mother's side, leaving one snarled tooth in the roof of my mouth, an itching post in the field of my thoughts, an ohm stone that shouts me down with its unintelligible alphabet. The past is a thing of flesh and blood in these opening lines. It is not a series of events that happened long ago, but rather a lived and felt experience that travels across bloodlines and finds a home in each generation. It is an embodied form of generational trauma. For our speaker, it is not a positive experience. De Puer creates a singular image to ground his feelings about the past and its ramifications in the present. A snarled tooth in the roof of my mouth. This singular small object becomes a symbol of, if not unwanted, then unwelcome history. We picture a tooth out of line with the rest. impossible to ignore and constantly brushing against the roof of the speaker's mouth. It is out of place, and it would help the speaker if it were gone. The word snarled carries a secondary meaning. We associate the word with anger. A snarled face or snarled mouth typically connotates rage, and so the tension of the poem is given a more violent edge in these early lines. From there is a leap into metaphor, and some of the modernist and beat techniques embraced by Inchi come to the fore. Primarily, there is a hint of the superposition. The superposition was a phrase coined by Ezra Pound, and it was a core tenet of the vorticist movement. The idea behind the term was a stacking or sequencing of two or more contrasting images, which when used correctly invokes an intensely subjective response to an objective thing. Essentially, it would create an image that could do nothing but move you. Paor does this with his snarled tooth. It is placed in contrast to two typically Irish things: an itching post and an Ogham stone. An itching post is exactly that, a post placed in a field by a farmer for their livestock to relieve any itches they might have. It is an intensely pastoral image, belonging to the rural-centric view of Ireland as an island of farmers connected to the fields and the land. It is a pigeonholed representation of the island, one that Paor's speaker is still feeling the effects of. Then there is the Ogham stone that shouts me down. Ogham stones are large-shaped rocks that stand upright. They bear a series of horizontal carved lines arranged in a sequence that makes up Ogham script. They were used for lots of things: place markers, headstones, signage. And they can be found around Ireland. Their exact origin or point of entry into Ireland is a mystery, with people arguing that they originate anywhere between the 4th century AD and the 1st century CE. What is largely agreed upon, though, is that they represent the earliest form of Irish language writing. Paor's inclusion of the stone is as much a nod to his linguistic lineage as his genetic one. The fact that it is shouting him down in the poem alludes to the nativist plea to reject modernity. When it comes to Gaeilge, Paor's evolution of the language stands in direct opposition to the traditionalist cry for preservation. The presence of a more ancient Ireland becomes the lens through which we see the second stanza. Curm ordo raur fe Eachel Feasa. Is lauren and galan os Each der Cofasa amok. Cool le kinne, mar is dúil kinne dead hort. Fuckle co crua le grania ganjeve fe chapan sule, eta iche co dlu le slugan isra. I put my swollen thumb under the tooth of knowledge, and the stone speaks up from the underworld of my thoughts. You were always a black sheep, like all belonging to you. Hard words like grains of sand in the corner of an eyelid, shut tight like an oyster. The snarled tooth is transfigured again, this time taking on a mythic form. It is now the tooth of knowledge. This, combined with the sucking of the speaker's thumb, leaves us in little doubt as to what the poet is referencing. It is the Bradán Feasa, or the Salmon of Knowledge, a famous story from Irish myth and folklore. It goes like this. Once upon a time, there was a poet called Finnegas, a wise and kind man who had been entrusted to educate one of Ireland's mightiest heroes, Fionn McCool. He liked the company of the boy, but his dedication to educating him often fell to the wayside in favour of Finnegas's lifelong pursuit, catching the Salmon of Knowledge. That salmon had had the good fortune of eating some enchanted hazelnuts and suddenly becoming aware of all the knowledge of the universe. Which begs the question as to how it was caught in the first place. But I digress. If another were to catch and eat this fish, they would, in turn, receive the knowledge of the universe. One day, with Fionn in tow, Finnegas somehow achieves his angler's dream and catches the clever fish. In his excitement, he sets about starting a fire. He and Fionn spit the now very unlucky salmon and begin to roast it above the flame. To his dismay, Finnegas realises they don't have enough firewood. And Fionn, not being the sharpest tool in the shed, yet, wasn't very good at collecting it. Finnegas begrudgingly sets about finding more, but not before he seizes the boy with a scruff of the neck and warns him not to eat so much as a single scale from the fish. Fionn, being a loyal and obedient sort, agrees and diligently rotates the fish. Unfortunately, a hastily cobbled together spit will not win any engineering awards, and so, upon one particularly vigorous rotation, the salmon falls into the fire. Fionn leaps up, instinctively reaching to catch the fish, pulling back just as he realises that scalding fish and human flesh do not a great combination make. But it's too late. As he is pulling back, his thumb is not quick enough and brushes against the fish. Fionn howled and stuck his now scorched thumb directly into his mouth. Alongside a perfectly roasted taste came the font of all human knowledge and wisdom. Finnegas returned with heaps of firewood. Fionn had pulled everything back together, but upon gazing into the boy's eyes, Finnegas saw the glow of ultimate wisdom where there had been absolutely none before. He realised, with an ache of a life wasted, that Fionn had tasted the fish on his thumb. It was said that from then on, whenever Fionn needed wisdom or counsel, shoving his thumb in his mouth would do the trick. In older versions of the story, shoving his thumb in and against a particular tooth, the tooth of wisdom, did the job. And so that is exactly what Paor is invoking when he talks about this. But why is he invoking the myth here? In putting his thumb in his mouth and against the snarled tooth, he is drawing a direct connection between that genetic outlier in his mouth and his feelings about Ireland's past, particularly Gaeilge and its use. It gives the stone a voice. It rears its head again here, chastising the speaker of the poem. You are always a black sheep, like all belonging to you. The weight of lineage returns and the poem's title, Heredity, reasserts itself. The black sheep is a common symbol of the outlier or odd one out in a family or society. Like all belonging to you ties it directly back to Paor's family. It makes it clear that it is inherited and somehow in the blood. Another way of looking at this might be Paor's association with Inchi and its radical approach to his native tongue. The Ogham stone could certainly be seen as a symbol for the nativist movement. It shames Paor for parting from depression. It shames Paor for parting from tradition. Those belonging to Paor could be his contemporaries and fellow Gaeilge modernists. The speaker could be struggling with whether his radical approach is really the right one. The weight of the Ogham stone's admonishment begins to take its toll. The speaker recognizes that these are hard words. The superposition returns as the speaker compares those words to grains of sand in the corner of an eyelid, shut tight as an oyster. The irritation this image stirs up is enough to make us rub our own eyes in sympathy. De Paor has chosen an oyster this time, moving his allusions to Ireland from field to sea. It is a testament to the poet's ability to layer related imagery. We think of an eye sealed shut, and it pairs nicely with the physical expression of anger and pain established by the word snarled in the first stanza. We now picture this grimace of the speaker as he struggles with his inner demons. The choice of an oyster, as we will see, is also a perfect setup for the third and final stanza. Before we take a look at those closing lines though, I have a favour to ask. If you're enjoying this episode, or if you've been listening to the podcast for a while, please consider subscribing or following, then rating and reviewing the podcast wherever you listen. Better yet, if you know someone who'd enjoy this episode, consider sharing it with them directly. There's a host of different ways to get in touch with this podcast down below in the description, including a Substack link to the episode script, complete with citations and references. With that being said, let's return to the poem. The third stanza continues its streak of potent imagery. Nor usclín scín tullis, a bhéal margin, tá fiacail sciabha in rad muvic, agus glés cohard le níomh an fearle, an ghoire neamh ferfa gan chevel. When a blade of light prizes it open, there's a tooth askew in my son's mouth. It shines like a pearl in his perfectly crooked smile. We would be forgiven if we were struggling to see how this poem could prize itself free of the weight and tension it has created. However, deliverance comes from an unexpected place for the speaker. This final stanza, for me, is one of the finest pieces of poetry I've read in a while. It builds on all the imagery that De Paor has already established, maintaining the world of the poem perfectly. Then it expertly subverts the tension and creates a wave of relief that lets us breathe again. The oyster comparison continues with the typical action of shucking an oyster or opening it with a blade to eat, though it's not some standard knife, but rather an image gilded with light. Here though, it's not some standard metal blade left on a kitchen table. De Paor's dedication to interweaving meaning hits us again. The blade of light on the physical level opens the oyster, but the clamped shut eye it represents is opened by a ray of sun. Hope washes over the poem as we can imagine that same soothing heat coaxing us to open our eyes gently. The speaker feels the same. When he opens his eyes, he sees the world from a different perspective. An out-of-place tooth appears again, but in a very different context. There's a tooth askew in my son's mouth. Gone is the aggressive language of snarled. In its place is the almost whimsical word askew. Something only slightly out of place, barely noticeable. This is, of course, the fact of it being his son that reframes things for the speaker. Now, lineage and bloodline take on a much more positive form. The shouting of the Ogham stone is banished, the weight of the past is gone. The tooth shines like a pearl in his perfectly crooked smile. The final line with the near oxymoron of perfectly crooked smile cements the speaker's acceptance of things. His son is a product of his lineage, his decisions and his choices, and he could not be happier about it. This poem is a testament to the strange psychogeography of the island I call home. It examines a tension that I think is lurking about the subconscious of many an Irish person's mind. The odd bout of guilt for not having learned enough Irish, or not having anything more than the couple focal. The strange relationship we have with our history is explored in it too. We live in an ancient place with a history and culture that was almost erased. Many of us can give you snippets of that culture, but sometimes we lack the depth of knowledge to feel a true sense of ownership over it, or to explain it fully. Finally, the poem resonates with a strange Irish want to be taken seriously by the world, to step away from the paddywhackery we were yoked with for centuries, and to be seen as a modern nation. That want has done more harm than good, and when conversations about modernity and what an Irish person should look like come up, our native language is often the first thing in the crosshairs. Louis de Puer's poetry helps to remind us that if we were to abandon our native tongue, it would be detrimental to us as a people. That being said, as this poem proves, modernisation of Gaeilge is not betrayal. It is necessary, though he struggled with this himself frequently. In the early days of his career, he was so staunchly loyal to the language that he refused to have his poetry translated. He felt translations only diluted the meaning of poetry from the more potent Gaeilge. This all changed after a stint in Australia, however. He came to see the value in translation for keeping the language alive, but also for examining the polarities inherent within the Irish identity. This poem is an artifact of the tension and guilt that many people carry. But in its beautifully written words, we see that this language, Gaeilge, can still stir every emotion a human can feel. And that, for me, made it a perfect choice for Seachtain na Gaeilge. What did you think of the poem? I'd like to point out that this is my interpretation, and as such, very much up for debate. If you did enjoy the poem, please consider subscribing to the podcast and rating and reviewing it wherever you listen. There are links to all the social medias for Words That Burn below. You can find them in the description. Theo Dorgan's essay is linked down there as well. And most importantly, the Substack, which hosts the script for this episode, is available at the link below, where you can read all about Louis de Puer's work and, more importantly, see the citations that back up the podcast. I want to say Gur Míle Mágat to all of you for listening this week. I appreciate it, and I hope that you'll hear from me again soon.